and here's Armondo sitting there, staring at me. And I thought to myself, I'm gonna die. I was in the crime family for 10 years, and it was at 30 years of age as a member of the crime family that I gave my life to Christ. 4 years after I gave my life to Christ, there was a 29-count indictment made by the FBI, an undercover sting operation. When that indictment came, they subpoenaed me now as a pastor, youth pastor at my church. They subpoenaed me to come back and testify against the crime family. And at that point, I mean, we're talking about testifying against my dad, my brothers, my family members. And so we prayed about that, Diane and I, my wife, and we decided that I would confess the crimes that I committed, regardless of where the chips would fall, but that I didn't feel God would have me confess the sins or the crimes of the rest of the family. So I found myself sitting in a courtroom where I was found in contempt of court. In the state of Arizona, when they find you in contempt of court, there's no end to the contempt of court. There's only 2 states in the country, Arizona and Texas, where if you're found in contempt, you stay in jail for the rest of your life or until you're willing to testify. And so when I was found in contempt because I felt I was doing what God wanted me to do, I thought I was going to be there for the rest of my life. One of the things that they did is they put me in a place called Durango. The prisons in Arizona were so overcrowded in those days. They were violent. So they put me in a cell, it was called D Block in Durango, that it only housed 20 people, but they had 60 inmates squeezed in. It was a melee. There were some cells around the outside, one central room, and it was a bloody brawl day and night. And so that's where they put me because the judge told me when he found me in contempt, he said, Mr. Colicurcio, the day that you're willing to testify, you just tell the guard, they'll call me and you're out of here. You can testify and go back to your life. You can go back to your wife and kids. And so I knew I had that option, but I felt like God had said, no, you confess your own crimes. They did not want to know what I had done. At that time, I had no power, no money, no prestige. The attorney general at the time looked me in the face and says, Frank, why would I want you? You're this guy that's found Jesus. You have no money. You won't help my political career. Putting you in jail doesn't help me. What I want is your testimony. And so they put me in this place, and they said, the reason I'm putting you here, the judge said, is because it will coerce you to testify. You say that you won't testify, but you've never experienced our system here and the hell of our system. In jail, you don't elect leadership. The people that lead in jail are the people that quite honestly don't care if they live, don't care if they die, they don't care if they get maimed, they don't care if they lose an eye or a leg or whatever. Those are the guys that lead in a prison block because they just don't give a stinking rip what happens to them, and it makes them dangerous. Now, in Durango, in D Block, we had 2 guys that led the place. One, we called him the Pope, great big monster of a guy, covered in bullet holes and knife wounds and everything else. And then we had this guy called Armondo. Now, Armondo was an El Salvador Freedom Fighter. For you history guys, you know what I'm talking about. When that rebellion was crushed, all the freedom fighters had to leave the country because they were putting them all to death. Many of them made it up into the United States. Armondo was one of those that had made it to the United States and started dealing drugs, which is about all he could do. And he was caught, and they were trying to extradite him back to El Salvador, where the moment he hit the ground, he would be put to death. Shot. He was the other monster in D Block, and it's kind of a unique guy. He was only 4 feet tall, about 4 feet wide, and the hairiest man I've ever seen in my life. And so I would sit there at night, and the brawls would start and everything else, and it was hell, to be honest with you, and crazy. I'd been there 6 weeks, and all of a sudden they called out my name, Colicurcio, blocked 6. And I thought, I finally get to get out of this and into a little tiny room. And I was so excited. I went over to the block, I opened up the door, and here's Armondo sitting there, staring at me. And I thought to myself, I'm gonna die. This is pretty much it. And when I walked in and he's sitting there, all of a sudden he goes like this, he points at my chest, and he pounds his chest like this. And I'm going, what do you want? And he goes, and all I had in my hands, I had 2 things. I had my Bible and 2 packs of cigarettes. Because when you go to jail, I don't smoke, but they give you cigarettes. Cigarettes is like money in jail. That's what you buy things with. And all of a sudden I realized he wants my cigarettes. So I'm going, hey, that's cool. I gave him my cigarettes, and he leaves. About 4 or 5 hours later, it's now about 2 o'clock in the morning. I wake up, he comes in and he shakes the bunk, and he's sitting there with a pile of cigarettes like this in his hands. And he dumps them all out onto the floor, and he points at the cigarettes, he points at me, he points at himself and goes like this. And I didn't know what he meant. And he points at the cigarettes, he points at me, and he pounds his chest, and he goes, and all of a sudden I realized what he meant was that we were partners. He had been out gambling with my 2 packs of cigarettes, and when you gamble with Armondo, he plays this game where he wins. I kid you not, that's what he plays. He wins, and if he doesn't win, he kills you or beats you within an inch of your life. And so all of a sudden I realized I've got a friend in Armondo, and he doesn't speak a lick of English. He only speaks Spanish. So to make a long story short, he and I start to become friends. In jail, you can hire an interpreter for about a half an hour for 2 cigarettes. And so as I started to get to know him, I started to share the gospel with him. And I started to share Jesus with him. And of course, he didn't want anything to do with it. He really wasn't interested. But whenever he wanted to talk to me, it was funny. I didn't tell you this one thing. Besides being a monster and a murderer and the hairiest man I ever knew, he had the funniest voice. He had this squeaky voice, like Tattoo on the island, Fantasy Island. He had this voice that goes like, hello? Hello? And whenever he wanted to talk to me, the only English he knew was, 1 minute, please. 1 minute, please. Whenever he wanted to talk to me, he'd have to go get an interpreter. So he'd say, 1 minute, please. And he'd go and he'd get an interpreter, and then they would interpret for us. And so finally, after 4.5 months, just by a miracle of God, I was released from the contempt charge. When I left, I shared the gospel with Armondo literally, I don't even know, over 4 months, several dozen times, talking about how much Jesus loves him and how short of Christ he will burn in hell, separated from God forever. But he would never trust Christ. When I left, I took my Bible and I wrote my phone number in it, and I gave him my Bible, never to see him again. 6 months later, I'm back in Washington now, back from Arizona. That's where all that took place. And I'm in the backyard with my kids, and my wife comes outside and she says, Frank, there's an overseas operator, a collect call for you on the telephone. And I had no idea who it was or what it was. So I came in and I answered, I said, hello. And they said, this is an overseas operator. We have a collect call for you from El Salvador. And they said, will you accept? I said, yes. And all of a sudden I heard this little voice, scratchy line. I hear this voice, it goes, 1 minute, please. And all of a sudden this guy comes on the line and he says, is this Frank? And I said, yes. And I can hear Armondo in back, like this. And he says, Armondo wants you to know that he's back in El Salvador. And he goes, Armondo wants you to know that he gave his life to Jesus Christ. Armondo wants you to know that he is going to be shot tomorrow. At which time I finally spoke and I said, I am so sorry. Armondo says, don't be sorry, dear friend. I'll see you in heaven. That's when I realized that for some people, the only Jesus they will ever see is me. For some people, the only Jesus they will ever see is you.